Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Pleased to be with you today at the virtual reading group. We are continuing to read The Human Condition by Hannah Arendt, or the Vita Activa, as it was originally titled, and the title it bears in the German edition. The book is structured in you can think about different ways to structure it, but one way I think that's helpful is that there's three middle chapters. They're not per se middle chapters, but they're the chapters in the middle of the book on labor, work, and action. And they are the chapters on what Hannah Arendt calls the fundamental activities of the human of the human condition: labor, work, and action. Of those three, Arendt makes explicit that the only one that is truly fundamental, in the sense that we cannot be human without it, is action. Now, as a result of that, there's a number of people, it's been, I think, one of the confusions or readings of Arendt that I like to, or I want to at least resist, is that action is this thing alone in a pantheon by itself in Arendt's work. First of all, one thing we've been deeply aware of as we've been reading this book together is the way that these distinctions she makes between labor, work, and action, while important in that they shed light on important aspects of the human condition and they give us insights, they're not meant to be strict separations. There is no such thing as pure work, and there's no such thing as pure labor or pure action. They always bleed into each other. And so let's not, put action up on this pedestal of, this is an act and it's the pure humanity. That's not what Arendt is about. But we do need to take it seriously. It is, for her, as she says, the only activity of man that no man can refrain from and still be human, on page 176. In other words, we can refrain from laboring and have other people labor for us, and we may be unethical and we may lose some of our life force because there's a certain life force that comes from laboring, but we're still human for her. And we can not work, we cannot produce anything. Whether you have money so you don't need to work, or for whatever reason, and still be human. But she says on 176, a life without speech and without action is literally dead to the world. It has ceased to be a human life because it is no longer lived among men. That's a strong statement, beyond a strong statement. And I think we're gonna have to ask. You're gonna have to ask yourselves, and we're gonna have to ask ourselves, to what extent we take that. How do we understand it, and do we agree with it? At its most basic level, if I seek to understand the statement before I say whether I agree with it or not, which is always a good practice, I think it means that a life without speech and action is a denial of what she calls the fundamental human condition of human plurality. And so to live without speech and action is to live without plurality, to live in a world in which there are not a plurality of human beings. And from her point of view, in her thinking, it is the human condition, right? Uh, is one of plurality. One of the things that when she in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, when she's trying to talk about what what would truly be a violation of human rights and what is truly a crime against humanity. So she's actually interested in the question of what is a crime against humanity. She says that the only true crime against humanity is a crime against plurality, the attempt to eradicate a particular people based on race or religion or some other characteristic from the face of the earth. That is a crime against the human principle, which she calls plurality. And so this section on action and this claim that action is the only activity that man can cannot refrain from and still be human is really deeply about what it means to live as in a plural world. And this idea of plurality is at the very foundation of what Arendt understands by the human condition and by politics. So if we look at the first line of this chapter on action, and of course I'm ignoring the two epigraphs for a moment. We'll come back to them. This is the only, not the only. This chapter has these two very famous epigraphs. One by Isaac Dinesen and one by Dante. The Dante one is just quite controversial, and Patchen Markel has done a wonderful, and Susanna Gottlieb have done wonderful readings of it. Arendt, according to them, both mistranslates the Dante in meaningful ways. We're not going to get deep into that, but if there are questions on it or thoughts, we can talk about that. But the first line, right? Human plurality, the basic condition of both action and speech, has the twofold character of equality and distinction. On the next page, she will end the following paragraph by talking about human plurality and the paradoxical plurality of unique beings. So what is this human plurality, this paradoxical plurality, the basic condition of both action and speech, which has the twofold character of equality and distinction? This is not an easy question to answer. Equality on one level, I think, is fairly clear in the way she's using it, that if men were not equal, they could not understand each other. There's a fundamental equality amongst humans, which is that this is in effect a Kantian point. We recognize each other as humans, as rational beings, as he will put it in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. And there's a basic equality that is foundational to what it means to be a human being. At the same time as there's this foundational equality, without which we couldn't even understand or recognize each other, there is a fundamental distinction. Now, the distinction is a much harder idea to grasp, right? Equality she does away with or she describes in one sentence. Distinction takes about a page here, and she makes she distinguishes three levels of this distinction, this twofold equality of character, equality, and distinction. There's three different levels of distinction. On the one hand, there's what she calls otherness, which is simply the otherness of things in the world. She calls it alteritas, but it's the inorganic matter. So the things are different, are other from myself. But she says that's different from distinguishing or distinctness, and only man can distinguish himself from other inorganic beings, but also other organic beings. And this, in this activity of distinction, in which we express ourselves and distinguish ourselves, and we come to appear, she says, as unique beings. So here are the three levels of distinction that she talks about: otherness, distinguishing, and then uniqueness. I mean, again, I don't want to make too much of all these distinctions, but I think it's worthwhile to see how she gets there. And what all of these three things do, these distinctness, is to allow ourselves, as she says, to distinguish ourselves from any other who was, is, or ever will be, right? So on the bottom of 175, if men were not distinct, each human being distinguished from any other who is, was, or ever will be, they would need neither speech nor action to make themselves understood. And so there's this distinction and there's this equality. And the basic point is that we act and speak because on the one hand, we're equal and can understand each other. On the other hand, because we're distinct and we need to show ourselves to others. And thus we act, we begin things, we put ourselves in the world, we say things, we speak. And with word and deed, we insert ourselves into a human world. And this insertion she calls a second birth. Along with this second birth is the idea of glory, right? Namely, that to act, she says, requires that we appear in the public world, and thus action needs, for its full appearance, glory. What she means by glory, the shining brightness we once called glory, and which is possible only in the public realm. So to act, to show our distinctness, to show our uniqueness, we need to appear. We need to shine in some way. And this idea of glory or shining, of appearing as distinct and unique, is fundamental for Arendt. She really does believe it is a deep impulse of human being. And so she'll talk on page 181 at the end of this section 24 about the unknown soldier and the tombs to the unknown soldier. And she says they're not accidental. They are a recognition of a refusal to accept action or war that doesn't disclose someone. That if we're to act, we need to appear. And when people die unknown in modern warfare, begin to die in these mechanical major attacks, and they're blown to bits, and we don't know who they are. It's an affront to their dignity, and as she says, that all those whom the war had failed to make known were robbed not of their achievement but of their dignity. This is really deeply embedded in Arendt's understanding of action, and as a part of human dignity, in which we, as plural, unique, distinct individuals, appear as who we are. In this section, she introduces, again, in a very innocent way, a word which has become anything but innocent in Arendt's scholarship, which is the word natality. When I first started teaching Arendt, I would prohibit students from using the word natality. I think it's one of those words that has become wildly abused and overused in the Arendt lexicon. It's a powerful word. That's why it has. She uses it sparingly. I think powerfully, but we need to take care. On the one hand, natality is the givenness in the fact that man is born. And on the other hand, there's a second level of natality, which she calls initium, or beginning, which she calls a second birth, in which we are born into, we act, and in being act, and in acting, we enter the world again, not as simply the nakedness of birth, but as a subject, as an actor. She's going to use the word hero. This is a controversial word, but I think it's important to realize that for her, every man is a hero, or every man has the capacity to be a hero. A hero is for her simply, as she says, is simply any man who enters. And as for Homer, she says on page 186, the word hero is the connotation of simply someone who's a free man, right? And as a free man can act. And so she has this kind of idea that every person can act, and in acting, become a subject and be a hero. One of the core ideas of her thinking around this is that when you act, you can't control your story, right? When you act, you enter the world, you have a second birth, but you're not the storyteller. You enter into a world of appearances, a web of appearances, into already existing stories and other people. And in that, entering into that web and into those stories, you give up your control over your story, and other people will tell it. And so this, who you are, is a very difficult and complicated and indeterminate idea in Arendt's work. One thing I think I should at least mention, which I haven't so far, so I'll stop and mention it, is this distinction she makes between two words for action in both Greek and Latin. On the one hand, arcane in Greek, and agere in Latin, and on the other hand, protane and gerere. The idea, it's a little complicated, and we can get into it more in Q&A, but the basic idea that is important for us to understand is that for her, the idea of action had two parts. It had the part of beginning, setting in motion, but it also had the part of ruling and governing. And over time, she thinks that these two ideas have been separated, and we largely think of rule as simply something done to other people, whereas for her, all acting carries with it a sense of both taking initiative and beginning, and also setting in motion, and thus also leading, and thus moving things forward in some way, and thus in some sense setting rules, setting things in new directions. And so for her, this idea of action is really rich and complicated, and can't be reduced to any kind of simple thought. I think what I'll do is now just take in the second section we read for today on 25 on the web of relationships. What I really want to say here is that for her, we act into a world, in a web, and thus action never achieves its purpose. And to the extent that action is made meaningful, it's made meaningful only by those who come later and tell stories about it. There's a tension in Arendt's work that is really worth us thinking about. I don't have answers to it. So she says on pages on page I'm sorry. She says on page 178 that when we begin something new, when we act, what we begin cannot be expected, that it has a startling unexpectedness. And that has the quality of a miracle. So what does she mean by beginning something new or acting? It seems to mean when someone does something extraordinary, when someone does something unexpected, miraculous. And what that does is it enters the world and people stop and look and say, oh my God, and they start talking about it. And maybe they blog about it, or they build a monument to it, or they write a story about it, or they write around the newspaper, and it takes up a world of its own, and it begins a whole new process, a whole new direction, and it sets things in a new direction. And so there's a way in which for her, action is this thing that's extraordinary. At the same time, in other works, she says something quite different, which is that every act, everything one does, even the most mundane thing one does, changes the world. And in doing so, is a kind of action. And are these contradictory? I think they can be reconciled, but we should at least be aware that, on the one hand, there's this sense of her in this book that action is a kind of extraordinary, unexpected newness, startling miracle. And yet there's also a way she recognizes that every human and everything we do has the potential to be an act, insofar as insofar as it enters the world, it becomes part of this web of experiences. And like the little butterfly, that flies its wings that will affect something, across the world, it will have impacts. And so everything we do is an action to some degree. The last section we read for today on the frailty of human affairs is actually the beginning of the next part of this chapter, but it relates. She returns to this idea that there's two ideas of action: arcane anagere, to begin and set in motion, and pratein and gerere, to finish or to bear the result. And what she really wants to say in this chapter, or this section, 2026, is that action is boundless. Once you act, it sets in motion a series of processes that never ends. And since it sets in motion a series of processes that never ends, it's never a closed circle. It's irreversible. And as irreversible, it's hard to contain, and it leads to an onslaught on the very possibility of a stable home or a world in which we live. And this is a frailty. It shows that action needs to somehow be contained, and yet it's uncontainable. And this is a problem for the human condition. The second frailty is that action is unpredictable. Not only is it unending and irreversible, we don't know where it's going to end. Any action you make, anything you begin, you may think that by giving a speech today, you're going to lead to solving global warming, but it may lead to the opposite, or it may have unintended consequences. And in the end, action only reveals itself to the storyteller. That is, to the backward glance of the historian, who indeed always knows better what it was all about than the participants. And that's on page 192. And so we have this frailty, the boundlessness and unpredictability of human actions. And there's a question of whether we should even act at all, right? I mean, if every action will go on infinitely and may have unintendedly awful consequences, it seems like action and speech would be futile, and not only futile, but dangerous. And so there has to be some response to what she calls the calamities of action on page 220. And the next four sections of this chapter are going to offer different responses to the calamities of action, how we can in politics respond to these frailties of action that the world contains. All right, I'll stop there. There's a huge amount that I didn't cover in these sections, and that's for you guys to bring up. And I will turn to you. There are two ways to make your voices heard, to speak and act, and insert a process into motion that's boundless and could have unintended consequences and could be calamitous. I'll try and reduce the calamity. But one is by writing in the chat. I don't have really the time to read that closely, but I know there's a vibrant conversation most weeks in the chat. And the other is by raising your hand, which you can do by going down to reactions, at least if you have the newer version of Zoom, and raising your hand. Hal, you have your hand raised first.
This chapter certainly raises a lot of different questions about what it means to act in the world, and the importance of that. And of course, she considers the public or the political realm to be the main arena, or a main arena of action. The question is, to what extent do people act as, because I'm not sure, in ancient Greece there was this idea that of equality of speech, not in the sense of like there was actually talk earlier this week, I forget who it was by, but it was one of the more free speech type organizations that was talking about the difference between Parrhesia, which is kind of like the freedom of speech in the sense that it's like unfiltered, as well as this idea of equality of speech. And I mean, the question is, does Arendt think there could be an equality of speech if some actions are to a certain extent greater than others, and are there arenas that are more or less appropriate for this? I mean, I know that I was reading, she talked about the trial, I mean, not the trial, she talked about the debate between Kennedy and Nixon, and she said that was kind of a farce. And I mean, yes, the question is, did she think it was a farce because she thought the format was a farce? I know when I saw the 16 candidates or whatever the hell, how many candidates there were last time around with the Republicans, I thought this is like a joke. This isn't like an actual debate. So like, what is kind of the appropriate realm for any of this today? Obviously, we don't like all live in this agora like the Greeks did.
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have I all I can say is she'll in the chapters that follow, right? The frailty of human action. She's going to offer in the Greek solution in chapter 27, which we'll read next time. But just so I can answer Hal's question. The idea of the Greek solution is that you need a polis, you need a political space, which she'll then rename in the next chapter, chapter 28, the space of appearance. That section is called Power in the Space of Appearance. And the argument, that she's making is that you need, for a political community to exist, you need power. And power exists in a public space, a space of appearance where people can appear. All people, citizens can appear. Okay, we can talk about citizens and all people, and we should, but for her, every human being has the potential, and every citizen has the right to speak in public. Um, and so if you're asking sort of what are the conditions for speech that Arendt imagines, it's a public space in which one has the right and the capacity to speak and act in meaningful ways. She actually first develops this idea in the origins of totalitarianism in the famous section 9, chapter 9 of the origins of totalitarianism, where she talks about what does it mean to have a human right. And she basically says that most things that people think are human rights are not human rights. No one has a right to live. We all die. No one has a right to eat. These are not rights. These are things that are good, but if you don't have them, you can still be human and you can die a meaningful death, and such. But what she says, the one thing that all humans need to be human is to be able to speak and act in ways that matter, to be listened to be heard. And that's reflected here in this opening sections on action, which we read today, where she says that to speak and act are the one thing that every human has the capacity to do, and that you cannot refrain from and be human. And so I think the answer I can most immediately give to your question, Hal, is you need a public sphere that provides a space to be heard. Now, you ask about equality. Does everyone need what does that mean to have an equal space? It's almost an impossible question. The philosopher Amrita Sen, whose work on the capacities, makes a very rich argument that in order to guarantee certain rights, we need to give everybody certain material goods in order so that they can participate in public, because they're not constantly worried about getting food or things like that. I actually think some version of that is quite consonant with Hannah Arendt. She says that every human being has a desire to appear and to speak and to be a who and to be meaningful. And she makes a distinction in some of her writing between poverty and misery. And she says, poor people can still have dignity and still speak and still enter the world, but miserable people cannot. And so in late in her life, when there's a conference on her work and people ask her about this, she says, well, of course there should be the basic needs of everybody should be taken care of so that there's no misery in the world. But I think she doesn't go as far as Sen, because she thinks poverty is acceptable, not misery. That would be my understanding of her approach to these questions of equality of speech. Hal?
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Susan?
Hi, Roger.
Hi, Susan.
Hi. So in section 25, which is the web.
Yep.
Yeah, the web of relationships, which is very fascinating. And I just need your help with this. And I think this is, maybe this is part of the tension that you were talking about. What I find that she does sometimes that kind of stops me in my tracks is she can, to me, she can be very practical. Yeah. But then somewhere in there, and I sorry, I don't have your edition, but it's about 8 paragraphs into section 25. She goes off into this invisible hand behind the scene, right? So Plato and Adam Smith and that whole concept that perhaps a lot of us are familiar with. And I almost sometimes read in her that, yes, and it's important to her, we should act and be seen and heard. And then she gets into this philosophical invisible hand behind the scene. And maybe I'm misreading it, but it kind of stopped me in my tracks. It was almost like, so, so if there's some, and then she's talking about the actor and, we never know what's going to happen when we insert ourselves out there. And yeah, true enough. But then this is where I get confused. Is she just inserting Plato to say, oh, and by the way, here's what the agents kind of thought? Or is this some indication also of her philosophy or thinking in terms of, yeah, we should act and we do act, and yet there's something else at play? And
It's a
I don't
great,
know.
it's a
Maybe I'm
great
kind
question.
of,
No,
okay, yeah, go ahead.
it's a great question, Susan. And I think it's the latter. She's not an academic. And so she's not going to just, turn to Plato and Smith to show her erudition.
Yeah.
So why does she do it? She's making a very particular argument here that every life has a story, and that the stories reveal who a hero is, right? But what that means is that there's that the person acting can't tell the story, can't direct the story. But it also means that, no great leader can direct the story, no philosopher king or economic planner, if you will. And so she's sort of here arguing against Plato, that there can be sort of a philosopher king who would, know how to direct things. And she's arguing against Marx, and that there could be a kind of central planning of some sort, or some way to organize and through science and know what's, how to structure an economy. So she says, by the same token, the simple fact that Adam Smith needed an invisible hand to guide economic dealings on the economic exchange market shows plainly that more than economic activity is involved in exchange, and that economic man, when he makes his appearance on the market, is an acting being and neither exclusively a producer, nor a trader, nor a barterer. So she's actually arguing against all economists who think that man is a rational animal, that we can predict rational economic behavior. Okay. So that's what she's arguing against there.
So that invisible hand is really the unknown. It's what we can't predict.
Yeah. So then she'll continue. The invisible actor is an invention arising from a mental perplexity, right? The mental perplexity is the unknown, the inability, but corresponding to no real experience. There is no such thing as an invisible hand. And so, she's really insisting that so that in her book on Origins of Totalitarianism, she talks about how both the Nazis and the Bolsheviks wanted to create a fictional, coherent worldview.
Right.
Right. And so here she says on 186, the fictional story, right, the one made by the Nazis or by the Bolsheviks, reveals a maker, just as every work of art clearly indicates that it was made by somebody. But this does not belong to the character of the story itself, but only to the mode in which it came into existence. The distinction between a real and a fictional story is precisely that the fictional story was made up. And that's what she's saying, is that anyone who thinks they can control or guide politics, that there's a science of politics, whether it's economics or whether it's political science or whatever it is living in a fictional world and is trying to impose that fiction on an impossibly complicated web of relationships.
Yep. Very good. Thank you. That helps.
Okay. Good question. Thank you. Let's see. Clara. Oh, no. Yeah, Clara's next, and then Bob. Clara, you need to unmute yourself.
Frail. Yes, I want to talk. How you say act?
Speak and act.
Talk.
Yes.
Speak and act. Yeah, in Arendtian terms. Okay. So I just want to say that two things. First, three things. One, that I agree with Susan that these sections and indeed this part of the book is amazing. Every time that I read, I found more and more different ways to approach what she is saying, and my admiration for Arendt and indeed for you, Professor Roger, is I say advancing and advancing and advancing. That's my first point. My second point is that what I learned from this reading this time is not only that speak and act, that you become human in terms of speaking and acting in meaningful ways, but I just discovered that, and listen to you, Professor Roger, that what Arendt also shows us or attempt to show us is that through speaking and acting, we can relate to each other in meaningful ways. And I found that very amazing. And my third point is that if we can go to the first sentence, the last paragraph, Professor Roger, and section 25. And after you read it, may I ask this question to Bill, especially because I want to know about his experience being an actor.
He can jump in if he feels like it. Yes.
But I'm not sure, this Bill T, or which Bill?
Bill, you, I really admire you, and I like when you,
as an actor,
when you just jump into the space, and especially because of the experience. Actually, I think that one of the elements of the last session, I thought it was one of the greatest section we have been doing these last months. It was the presence of the artists around us. So if you can read it, Professor, you can help me, Professor Roger, to read the last sentence, and then I will pass my question to Bill.
The last sentence?
Yes, it says this is also.
Okay, this is also why the theater is the political art par excellence. Only there is the political sphere of human life transposed into art, right? By the same token, it is the only art whose sole subject is man and his relationship to others. So the idea here is that and this is what we were talking about last week, as Clara said, the arts that are more not about producing a static work that stays in the world, but that are actions and imitations of people, which is a question of, whether that's a questionable interpretation, but that's her interpretation from Aristotle, that the tragedy is a mimesis, or an interpretation or an imitation of people. And then there's the chorus, in which people comment on the action or the plot, and in that commenting, the chorus does not imitate, but as she says, reveal in some sense the story from a kind of from the perspective of the viewers. They sort of, in a sense, the chorus is that body that tells us how, in a sense, to view the story and the work, and in doing so, it memorializes and tells a story and gives meaning to actions, and in doing so, it engages in politics, and that's why it's the most political art in her telling. Bill, if you want to respond to that.
Mara, thank you very much for bringing me into it. I wish I could say that I am an actor. I am actually coming out of an art form that was reacting against theater in a way, the world of movement that has informed my understanding as an artist rebelled against the tyranny of text, and it rebelled against the tyranny of narrative. Now, those are all young men's terms that people went to dance because dance promised an abstraction that was, one, free of language, free of the narrative. And then there is this underlying political notion that by its very nature, the body, it becomes the site of all the great human questions. So when you participate watching, hopefully it's a good performance of dance, it is already implicitly the one and the many. That is one of the things that the nobility of gesture and the uniqueness of your body is at once representing all bodies in the world. So that I think that's maybe what you're getting at. There is something about understanding our body as being an opportunity to speak about the very particular of who we are, but the journey that all bodies must take. Now, is that a political or is that a philosophical point of view? But I think dance has threatened people over time because it has taken divinity away. It's taken politics and power away. And it is that those individuals, their puny bodies, are representing this huge project, which we call humanity. How is that for a grandstanding response? Yes.
It's interesting, Bill. I'll let Clara say something too, but and Tara put this in the chat, and I think it's true. You know, Arendt doesn't think the body itself reveals much.
And we talked about does Hannah Arendt ever have sex?
Yeah. But I think dance gives the lie to that. Although, I mean, dance is not simply the body itself, right? I mean, the dance is the body in motion, in particular motions. I would imagine you would agree with or not.
Say it again, Roger. It is
dance is not simply putting the body itself in public on stage. It's putting the body in motion in particular ways with a certain, I don't know if narrative is a word you'll accept, or a certain meaning.
Well, it has been said that the minute you take a person who actually in Grand Central Station, who stands perfectly still with everyone moving around them, that's drama.
Yeah.
And we immediately impose upon that person the all persons. And then everything becomes a huge metaphor. Now, that's a very high way of looking at dance, particularly those persons who believe in abstraction. But I don't know if anyone on this call knows Eiko Otake, formerly of Eiko and Koma. She has a kind of, they come out of, I don't know if Eiko would agree, but they come out of something called Buto, which was a type of work which some people say is a result of the bomb being dropped in Hiroshima. The movement was extremely slow in some of its manifestations. It's very distorted. She no longer works with her husband, Koma, but she has done this simple event where imagine the Japanese, distressed Japanese woman of the imagination, sometimes in a bedraggled kimono, but she says, and she calls it body in space. And she has done what I just said. She, through very minimal gestures, kind of overwrought. There's a book called A Body in Space, Fukushima, in which she did a photo essay that's now a book, moving through that landscape that we all know, the great shame of the nuclear age, but this fragile metaphor of a human body. No words, just to see her, or Pompidou Center, or Wall Street, but this fragile body, this metaphor of a body, it's extremely eloquent. And it is not virtuosic, but there's something about the fragility, her embracing her fragility. She and I have talked about the fact that she is also placed into a guilt that Americans have about the war, and it's the Japanese woman doing it, but I think she's above that. So I think she's one of the great ones working right now with this idea that when you take one body and you separate it from the bodies of others around it with some simple activity, suddenly a metaphor and a drama of immense proportions. And it feels, Roger, like it's anti-action. It feels like it's anti-action.
Why does it feel, why? Can you say why?
Well, I don't know. I feel like the conversation this is a thank you very much, but does the conversation, like, how does memory work in art? Is it possible that can you stop memory? Can the moment be so arresting that there is now only the now? And I think that that's one thing that we've been talking about is action knocks on and causes other actions. What happens when a performance is so mesmerizing? I know it happens with music, that the world stops. And is that possible? And that is the opposite of action. You are left with the dilemma of being alive, your breath, your heart. Is that the same thing as action?
Yeah. Tara, do you want to come into this? I mean, because you brought up this question about the body. Do you want to enter this?
I'll just say that I was kind of tracking that a bit, and I also remember I'm just very interested in the way that she categorizes the body appearing, because I know she talks about it also in the article on Little Rock, and it also in terms of race, and this seems to be the body appearing in public. We certainly don't have control over that, right? How it is perceived. What stories are projected onto it. And therefore she insists that that body must speak. I just put in the chat that the body must say what it has done, what it has done, what it will do, and what its intention is. And so I interesting tension with the idea of dance, and she seems pretty insistent that there is no anything that can really replace language. She doesn't want to speak of speech in a metaphorical way. She seems to really insist that speaking is speaking. It's not speaking through this or through dance or through the body. And I'm not necessarily endorsing this. I just think it's an interesting, that there's a lot to tease out there about how the body appears in public. And that I think there is something really possibly something generative there or progressive about the way she's thinking about that.
I wonder how she felt about Zen Buddhism and or Buddhism in general, this idea of a kind of, is it removing from the world and less intellectualizing, not being attached to, and as a matter of fact, speaking is a liability actually. And I think, Roger, this idea of when you act, you cause the unknown to ripples. If you want to stop the unknown ripples, stop acting.
Yeah.
Now, and I wonder how she feels about that.
Yeah.
Can I jump in on that for a second?
Jason. Yeah, Jason.
Yeah, I think and she brings up a very interesting portion in this text that for me, as someone who's been studying Buddhism for a long time, she gets into the issue of interest, and she goes to some effort to actually go ahead and tease apart what interest really is. And it's the space between us that becomes potent, and that becomes where we act, and that becomes where we dance, it becomes where we are seen. And that interest, I think, is where she's starting to touch on that question of the primordial, presence of space and how we then reflect each other in it.
That's a great point. I left that out in my introduction, so I'm glad you brought it up, Jason. Interest is an idea that she talks about in many of her works. Interesse is where it comes from, and it means to be in between, as you rightly said, what lies between. And she talks about it here in two senses: in an objective sense, in that it's the objective reality of the world that lies between us, but also in a subjective sense, the web of human relations that connects us and lies between us, and allows us to disclose ourselves as subjects. And what a couple of you have been talking about is, well, is this a linguistic thing? Is this an action thing? I mean, the whole premise of this section is that it's both. It's act and speak and act. Does she have a priority for one or the other? She thinks they're a little different, right? So she says, without speech, action would lose its revelatory character. And I think some things that a couple of you have said, Jason and Bill and others, I think really and Tara puts that in question. Can you reveal who you are without speech? And I think in some important ways you can. And I think she doesn't see that. On the other hand, speechless action, she says, would no longer be action because there would no longer be an actor. Well, okay, that's the revelatory. And so while she thinks speech is closer to revelation, action is closer to beginning. But I've always felt that distinction she makes doesn't hold up. That doesn't mean it probably means I don't see something she saw. I don't know. But I think some of the things that Tara, Jason, and Bill have said raises, I think, real questions about that distinction. And most of the time she speaks about speech and action together. It's only very few moments when she sort of tries to distinguish speech and action. And I just don't see it. I have to admit that's a part of her work I've never been able to make sense of.
Hey, Roger, it's Susan
may
again.
I?
Sorry. Go ahead. Okay.
No, I wanted to jump in, sorry, briefly, because, between the revelation, and the action, there is the condition of possibility of both revelation and action. And I think a very important, idea she brings up is the who and the what. When you act towards other people in terms of what they are, you're not allowing those others to disclose the who. And the what, can be race, can be religion, can be anything. So, there she's speaking from the point of view of the person who acts, but not from the point of view of the person towards whom or what you act, right? What happens when you deny others the possibility of disclosing the who because you behave towards them as a what? Yeah. That is my question. And I think that, the issue, you work a lot, Roger, about sortition. And I think that we can discuss, the potential of sortition and etc. But what you do not remove from the sortition or the jury is the kind of personnel about acting I don't want to use the word acting, let's say behaving, right, towards each other, not in terms of who you can be, but what you are. And I'm going to leave the comment on that. And I think that prevents, the disclosure of the who, is denying the voice, basically.
I think that's correct. So a good comment. There's a lot more to say about this, but I'm going to move on to the question list and people can bring it back up if we want. But I just want to give other people, other ideas a chance. So Bob, you're next.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bob, are you here?
I'm here. I'm puzzling over a statement, a clause here on page 179, which may give us entree into, I don't know, some of what Arendt's idea of action is, or maybe there are several ideas of action here. It's toward the middle of the page, and the clause is, but if nothing more were at stake here than to use action as a means to an end, etc., etc. So what I take this to mean, nothing more than to use action as a means to an end. Typically, when I act, I have an end in mind, but this seems to me to suggest something of action for action's sake. So in other words, maybe there's a kind of a hierarchy of actions. There's the action which will gain you immortality or fame. And there's kind of the small action, which maybe you do for interest or some other reason. But does she have a concept of action for action's sake? Is this part of what she's talking about?
If I could piggyback, and I had the same section mark, but a different comment, which was that speech is, I said it sounds odd because it goes on to say that, what I wrote was speech is far more convenient than sign language. Her comparison to sign language just threw me for a loop there.
All right, let me first take Bob's question. So the answer to that, Bob, is yes. Right. So action for her is something one does. Now, obviously, as you said, we often have lots of ends. We act in order to make money or set to accomplish some goal. And there's that element of action, but the way she's thinking about action as something that begins something anew and sets something in motion means that action is not to be that when I act, what I hope to accomplish, or even what I do accomplish, is not necessarily what is meaningful about the action. The action, I may fight a war for self-defense or in pursuit of my interests. But if that were all I were doing, then the action wouldn't have any meaning besides me accomplishing my goal. And I could probably do it in other ways, maybe even more efficient ways. What she's saying is that, yeah, action in its truest form has no end. Its end is simply what it does, and then what people do with it, how people see it and interpret it and react to it and create and keep it going. And so whatever end I acted for may have very little to do with the ultimate importance of my action. And so to the extent that the greatest actions for her are the ones that are least contained by interests or parochial ends or self-interest or anything like that, but act in a way that is productive and fertile in creating new ways of thinking that were unexpected and unseen. So yeah, that is an important and deeply meaningful part of her understanding of action. So, it does raise a question, I think, of, are actions that seek ends less fertile and less generative than actions that are sort of simply action? What would be an action that doesn't seek an end? It's hard to sometimes know, but she'll give some examples later in the text of forgiving somebody. Forgiveness can be, what's the end of that? It's hard to know sometimes, but it can be an action that can have enormous repercussions throughout society and throughout the world. So things like that, making a promise and holding to a promise. Again, maybe there's some interest there, but even if against your interest, you hold to a promise, can have enormous resonances across time and place. And so these kinds of actions for her are the purest, in many ways, kind of actions.
To the extent that action is untethered from an end, I think it could become suspicious that it's maybe the equivalent of what Sartre one place calls a moral acrobat. And this is kind of an action acrobat.
Yeah.
Just do something. Just don't stand there, do something.
Right.
It could be kind of a provocation. I'm going to do something and see how people react.
Right. But I think you're right. If some guy stands in the middle of the street, Bill said in Grand Central Station, and just stands there, well, okay, it could be just whatever. And yet it may have some meaning to it, depending on how it's done and how people react to it. Forgiveness. I mean, I think forgiveness is one of those actions that Arendt has in mind. And I don't know how you see it, Bob, but when someone forgives someone, it may not be because they want to accomplish something, whatever. They may just believe, it's an act. I forgive. It's what I do. And that pure act of forgiveness is so powerful, and can have enormous repercussions, right? Or not. I mean, does that act? It's not just some guy getting into the middle of Times Square and saying blah 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 blah, right? I mean, you're right. That doesn't do much. But getting into Times Square and stopping and intending and reading Hannah Arendt in the middle of Times Square for 24 hours. Again, what's the purpose? Who knows? But in certain circumstances, so for example, Tanya Bruguera, who was a friend of mine and was an Arendt Center fellow for a year and did a number of events with us. One of the things that first brought her to people's attention was sitting in the main square in Cuba and reading The Origins of Totalitarianism, over 2 days. What's the purpose? Who knows? And yet it has an impact. Those kind of actions are the kind of things I think she's talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah. Who's next? Alex.
Hi, Roger. Hi, everybody. I am curious about, so there's Hannah Arendt has mentioned religion, Christianity, and this kind of, I guess, the world of the sacred several times so far, and it comes up in these sections as well. And she makes it very clear, the saint has no place in the public world, right? The saint has to kind of act in private or act in secret. And there was a discussion earlier about that in an earlier section. But the reason I bring that up is I find it interesting that at the same time, she uses a lot of, I guess, sort of typical religious vocabulary, or maybe even theological vocabulary. So she will speak of revelation, right? The truth in the political world is a kind of revelation of the who, right? She will talk about a kind of creation out of nothing, and that's her understanding of freedom. She will talk about a miracle, right? And so, I mean, some of this seems to be, metaphorical maybe, but I guess that's what I'm wondering about, So in a way, she seems to kind of place herself in the Judeo-Christian tradition with those terms. And I'm also thinking, I know that Augustine was very influential for her, and also Karl Jaspers. So I'm curious about that vocabulary, and what it really means. And I guess
my kind of, I guess the thought I have is, it seems like when it comes to action, she definitely resists, the Christian way. That has no place in the public sphere. But then when it comes to meaning, things may be a lot more ambiguous. And, when she describes the meaning of action, she seems to be borrowing a lot of this religious vocabulary. And so I guess I'm wondering, is there something sacred there? Is she talking about the sacred in a way? And what to make of that?
That's a great question, Alex. I think she's trying to talk about meaning, right? And we have different vocabularies to talk about meaning. The Greeks talked about meaning through greatness and immortality. Different religions talk about meaning in different ways, through transcendence or godliness or divinity or blessedness. Arendt is trying to develop a political vocabulary for meaning. She's talking, she says at one point in this book, there is no politics without transcendence into an earthly immortality. Transcendence, right? But not transcendence into a divine city of God, but transcendence into an earthly immortality. So I think you're absolutely right that she uses a whole host of words and concepts that are often borrowed from poetic, religious, and mythological orders, because those are often the orders in which we speak about meaning outside of our mundane daily lives. And she does so in a way that borrows these words, makes clear that she is, and yet tries to use them in a way that I think is not religious or mythological or poetic, but is political. What does it mean to find immortality, not in divinity, but in being remembered for one's actions? What does it mean to become a who, not because you're in the image of God, but because you have the courage to act and choose to be remembered rather than to live? So these are attempts to think this deep, meaningful world, which has traditionally been understood in other registers, in a political register. I think that's what Arendt is trying to do. I think it's a big part of her work. I don't think it's, and by the way, I think it's a part of her work that has largely been ignored by most Arendt scholars because they're uncomfortable with questions of meaning and religion. And they've pushed that part of her away. I don't know if I hope that speaks to your question, Alex.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks, Roger. It's making me, you mentioned Kant, I think, earlier, and it's making me think that it seems like for her, politics is the world of the noumenal, in the Kantian sense, the things that don't have a price, that are, the world of freedom, and yet it's not, it's very kind of concrete freedom. No, it's a lived kind of freedom rather than, even in Kant, you have this kind of abstract morality and a kind of separation. And it seems like she wants to overcome that.
I think that's right. In Numinal, I'm gonna push back a little bit on Numinal, but I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, this is the critique that many people make of Arendt, that she sort of that she talks about politics as if it's this, numinal thing that, we're going to have, we're going to live in politics and free, but you never talk about healthcare or welfare or housing. And so this is, I think, one of the critiques that people, I mean, it's probably the most common critique of Arendt's basic approach. And, I think Arendt herself certainly thought that you needed things like healthcare and welfare and housing and food to an extent, but probably to a lesser extent than some others do. She was more on the avoid misery front. But I mean, that's a level, I think, of degree rather than quality. But what she thought was that, assuming we have that, there's a possibility in a non-religious, non-metaphysical world to build meaningful worlds and lives. And that's what I think she's engaged in as a project.
May I say something, Roger? Something very short. I would say that it's not only less metaphysical. I would say it's less metaphysical and more meaningful and more hermeneutical. Did I pronounce well the word hermeneutical?
That's fine.
Okay, I would say that. Thank you.
Thanks, Cara. Lena, you're next.
Hello, thank you, Roger. I just wanted to say now, responding to what you just said, because see, I'm also a local councillor. So I'm working in local government. And in a way, it's interesting how with Arendt, when we talk about political, there are these conjuring images in my head of speaking and acting in the public sphere, whilst actually it's all about emails, about rats and waste and rubbish and, or sorting people's poverty problems, how will they pay their next bill and so on.
Yeah.
So it's, there's an interesting kind of a contradiction there. But I wanted to talk about, and we've touched on it already, a bit about isolation. If we go to page 188, and just at the beginning of 26, it says, action as distinguished from fabrication is never possible in isolation. To be isolated is to be deprived of the capacity to act. And then when I think about last week, when we were talking about how artists create these great works of art, which are, permanent, and, that they do it in isolation almost, like, or they do it in the private. And the importance of that private, where we can be so unique and we can distinguish ourselves from social sphere or in a way public sphere, or in a way we can then come out in the public sphere and claim our uniqueness or something. So I guess what's my question? My question is in a way around isolation. To which degree is this isolation ever possible? Because in my head, it just isn't. Even when she talks of natality and she talks about being born and starting something new, but we are born from a mother's body. It's a very, very contextual event. It happens from one body that comes to another, and it happens in a very geographical space, in real places. So I just wonder, if you could say a bit more about this idea that she has on isolation. What is it actually?
Yeah, somebody, it may have been you, Lena, and I apologize now for not knowing the name. Somebody this week wrote me about artist collectives. Was that you? Or
yes, it was. Yes.
Yeah. So this is related to that question. So I'll try and speak to both because it was a good email and good question. So, I mean, I think you've set up the question well. Arendt believes that in order to create something original, a new painting or a new work of art, new play, whatever it is, you need to cut yourself off from the world. Why? Because if you're living in the world, you're going to be caught up in the cliches and the conformities of the world. And to a certain extent, you need to isolate yourself from that, to inoculate yourself from that, so that you can have a new idea. Now, once you have the idea and you write your play or make your dance or make your painting or write your poem, putting it into the world is an act, because then you're engaging with others. But the actual idea, composition, is for her something you do in isolation. And if you're completely isolated and you can't ever put your, if you're in a concentration camp or you're in a isolation cell or whatever, then you can't act. You can't ever put your work into the world and have it be responded to, so that you can speak and act in a meaningful way. So she has this idea of creation, which is very individualistic. One of the funny things about being the head of the Hannah Arendt Center is I get a lot of emails about Ayn Rand. For some reason, people combine them. I don't know why, but
they're both Aristotelians. That's probably why.
I think they're two of the few women, who with European sounding names, Ayn Rand, Hannah Arendt. I don't know. I mean, it just shows you they're two women, old women, that, so people think they're the same. It's funny. But, one of the things that I think is somewhat similar about them, although very little in many ways, is their suspicion of collective projects or collective works. And, Elena, you wrote me this really, I thought, beautiful account of all these different artist collectives and new prizes that are being offered for collective works of art. And, and asking to what extent, why would Arendt not recognize them as works of art because they're collective? Are they more actions? And I don't have a great answer to that, except, I'm not sure. I think, this is one of those places where she makes these distinctions. And I think that if we hold too fast to all of her distinctions, we do a disservice to her thinking. These distinctions are not meant to isolate and reject. They're meant to make us think. And I think, what you see now is the emergence of collective persons, collective entities, whether it's collectives or corporations or nonprofits, et cetera. And I don't think you should deny, or artist companies. I mean, I know I've had a lot of experience with that. I know Bill has a very company-centric idea to some degree of his creative process. I mean, I've talked to him about that. And I don't think she would reject that in the end. I just think that she, in that sense, the company or the collective has to have a kind of isolation that separates itself so that it can create in her mind. So yeah, that's my attempt to think through some of those issues, Lena. I don't know if that helps, but.
And Roger, Lena, may I just jump in and say, right now, one of the biggest biggest conversations going on in my world is people saying that it is hierarchical and that there is the cult of the individual genius. Now, these are young people, and some of us look snide and say they haven't had enough experience or enough success, but they do believe that that's a problem, because that individual genius now has a chokehold on that pipeline between the funding, which is oftentimes individuals or grants or what have you, and that distribution, which I suppose is the public or what have you. So it's being really challenged in the world that I come from right now. Decenter the singular maker. Acknowledge that it is a group action.
And it's the same in politics. Think about Occupy Wall Street or other movements. in which the whole premise was a leaderless movement, right? People are rejecting the idea of the leader, the great actor, and saying, we don't need that. We want to create consensus. We want to work from the bottom up. And that works, I think, somewhat, but think about what the world would have been like without Winston Churchill. I mean, just to think of one example in politics, right? And so, I think what Arendt is saying to some extent is, and this really brings this really to me brings me to my highest reveries for humanists and whatever. What would it be like to live in a human world where we don't tell stories about people? What if we only told stories about collectives? What if we only told stories about, movements? It would change what it means to be human, right? I mean, it would be a massive shift. And I don't think she's saying we can't tell stories about movements. We can, but I think to some degree, she also believes and that part of being human is that each individual has the capacity to be a hero. I mean, that's her hero in the sense of a free subject, and thus to have a story told about them, be the subject of a story. And I think there's a lot of people right now who are very critical of individualism, very critical of capitalism, and are, let me put it in my way of putting it, not critical enough of collectivism. Partly because I think they don't have much experience right now of collectivism. People coming from Eastern Europe or Russia or other countries, when they hear that, are often quite more suspicious of it. And they have more of a memory of it than a lot of people, especially young people today. And so, which is not to say rah-rah individualism. It's just to say that there are limits to both. And I think it's important to be able to tell those stories that recognize individual subjects as well as collective subjects. Robert.
Yes, Roger. I just wondered if you could identify.
Robert, I'm going to ask you to turn your video off again so we can hear you. Your internet is again a little wonky.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
A little better, yes.
Can you identify the quotation from Dante at the beginning of the chapter? What's the source?
The source is De Monarchia. If you're asking for a more exact source, let me see if I can. I'll be honest. I'm gonna cheat here and consult my an article by Pachin Markel. The article is called "The Rule of the People," and it's from De Monarchia. It's De Monarchia 1.2. If that helps.
It helps. Thank you.
Yeah. Is that it?
Well, who is the critical? Who are the critics you mentioned?
So someone, a wonderful two wonderful Arendt scholars named Susanna Gottlieb, who first wrote about this Dante quote, Gottlib, and then Pachin Markel, Markel. And if she gives the Latin and she gives the English on page 175. If you look at page, hold on. If you look at page, oh my God. She basically says in a footnote that the last line of the Dante quote is untranslatable. Where does she say that?
That's just what I was going to say. I was going to go into that, Roger.
Yeah, well, you're asking a lot of me. But she does say on page 208, so not in what we read today, but on 208 and footnote 41, she says,
Wait.
footnote 41. So footnote 41 says,
Hold on, Professor Roger. Page what?
208.
Okay, thank you.
So she says about 3/4 of the way down the page, she says, the human sense of reality demands that men actualize the sheer passive givenness of their being, not in order to change it, but in order to make articulate and call into full existence what otherwise they would have to suffer passively anyhow. And then she says in the footnote, this is the meaning of the last sentence of the Dante quotation at the head of this chapter. The sentence, though quite clear and simple in Latin, defies translation. Now, let's just read that again. The human sense of reality demands that men actualize the sheer passive givenness of their being, not in order to change it, but in order to make articulate and call into full existence what otherwise they would have to suffer passively anyhow. So we all have a being, the passive givenness of our being, who we are. And reality, the fact that we live in a real world, demands that we act and we take our who we are and move it from passive to active, not to change it, but to become who we are. So that's how she's reading it. And so in the last sentence of the Dante quote that she cites, it says, thus nothing acts unless by acting it makes patent its latent self. So in acting, we take what's our latent character and who we are, and we make it real, patent. According to both Susanna Gottlieb and Patchen, that's a wild mistranslation of Dante. Nil igitur agit nisi tale existans, quale patiens file debet. And I don't, my Latin is not good enough to understand this, but according to them, almost all Dante scholars have a completely different understanding and translation of this, and Arendt has willfully mistranslated it. This is where I have to sort of plead ignorance. I don't know enough to make it. I can tell you what Patchen and Susanna say about it, but that would take us far afield, and it would get me involved in things.
Can you tell us where?
Well, Patchen has an article
where they say that.
Patchen has an article, as I said, called "The Rule of the People," and it's in the American Political Science Review, volume 100, number 1. Susanna Gottlieb has a book called "The Regions of Sorrow" from Stanford University Press. And those would be the places to look.
Thank you.
Yeah. John Stern.
Roger, everything that we hear and are speaking or relating about action and speech, they're meant to be a double-edged sword. Is that not correct? Or is that part of it? That there is that all of this, all the comments about action and speech imply, or it's embedded the negative also, that it's a twin-sided coin.
Absolutely.
So that it for me, when I look at page 180 at the bottom, and it says action without a name, a who is meaningless, I'm troubled. It troubles me because when I when I think of all the bestial acts by man to man, and we seem to be fully engaged in another round in this country. They become whether they're nameless or they're not. They're never meaningless. They're all ugly. Just from one aspect, if we never knew what Luther tapped or attached to the door of the church, all his injunctions would still have a great deal of meaning. There would be nothing meaningless about the evil that's attached to them. We don't need to know the names of the police officers that abuse Black people in this country for them to be meaningless. This troubles me. There's nothing meaningless about that at all.
Yeah, no, I don't think she means meaningless in that sense. I mean, clearly anonymous actions can have impacts and be meaningful in that sense. The way she's using meaning here is as to disclose who one is, and thus meaning is what one is when one becomes a dignified human being who acts and is accorded the recognition of being heard and responded to, and thus made meaningful. A meaningful act can have no impact, or it could have impact. It doesn't matter. Whether it has an impact or not doesn't actually determine whether it yields meaning to the actor. Just like, as you said, an anonymous act that has no meaning can certainly have impact and be important in the world. It just doesn't have meaning in the sense of making my life or a life dignified and human. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just a question of
are you using the term meaningful label?
Say that again.
Are you using the term meaning really when you mean label?
No, I mean, I think she wants to say that what gives a human life meaning is action, is acting and disclosing oneself and being seen and heard. It's not whether your action succeeds or not, right? This is, I forget who asked the question earlier about this, but she doesn't think that someone who succeeds in making a lot of money or fighting a war and winning is a meaningful person. They certainly impact the world and they have whatever, but she thinks that what makes them meaningful is not whether they win or whether they lose, but whether their actions are seen and heard and seen to be meaningful and great in some way. And that question of meaningfulness or greatness for her is not the same as effectivity or impact. Right? I mean, Anton Schmidt, for her, is a deeply meaningful figure, even though he's largely forgotten by most human beings. But I think the double-edged sword pattern of it goes the other way. And here's where you're right. Hitler, I think, is also a meaningful figure. I don't, there's people who do acrobatics to try and find ways that Arendt doesn't mean that, but as far as I understand her, she does. She's someone who acted and spoke in ways that made people respond and made him seen. And some people saw him as good, some people saw him as evil. Now most people see him as evil, but he was still meaningful. Not because he succeeded, but because he got people talking about him and he's become, in a sense, almost the epitome of a meaningful figure, the meaning of evil. And the story about him is known by everybody. That's what makes him meaningful, not that he did well in the war or not, but that his name stands for something.
But suppose he was nameless. Wouldn't he still just as equally be meaningful?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think if we didn't know who Hitler was, it would be a very different, we wouldn't be able to put a whole host of qualities and characters and psychology and looks and stuff onto and who, I think it would be very different.
But you'd still have 6 million dead.
Yeah, you still have 6 million. I don't mean that. Yeah, of course you'd have 6 million dead, and you'd have a lot of other things. So it would have changed the world and this and that. But as a person, Hitler would not be, we wouldn't know who Hitler was.
I need to think.
Yeah,
Truthfully,
we'll talk more about this next week, I believe. She talks about this on page 205. So if you want to look at it, and we'll talk more about it next week when we read this chapter on the power and the space of appearances. But it will come up then.
yeah, I'll look forward to it.
Okay. Nancy.
Yeah, I'm on. I had two questions. One was about drama on page 187. And she seems, when she's talking in such a lofty way about the chorus having a sort of almost definitive opinion of the action that's taking place. I get this feeling, because I've worked on Greek drama a lot, that she's kind of reduces three playwrights, three tragedians' habits into this one paradigm. The chorus is quite different for each of the tragedians and for the different plays. And there's really, it's really not quite right to say that the chorus is able to be the interpreter and the sort of final guide for the audience as to what to think, because mostly Greek tragedy is provocative, and you don't have at the end a sense that you're ready to vote, let's say, for Antigone or Creon, or for Agamemnon or Clytemnestra or Orestes. I mean, there's some plays where you're guided much more and you have less wiggle room, but in general, I think that the way it worked in the Athenian democracy was to provoke debate. So it's more as if that genre of poetry, which does have an affinity in the Athenian polis, it's sort of like what Plato says in the Phaedrus, half a century later, that it's the beginning of logos, the arche logou, that it's kind of provocative to conversation and discussion. So that was one comment. I don't know if you, my second comment or question is on page 189, when she's talking about arcane and protein, and then agora and gerere in Latin. She sort of doesn't, this is a complaint I have often, and usually she turns out to be right, but I still get uneasy about it. She doesn't her way of dealing with polysemy, with multiple meanings of a Greek word, is, I mean, she's got all the scholarship in a way, but for example, protein only occurs to mean pass by in epic. It doesn't mean that in any later texts. And she doesn't, like protein has a more durative quality, to act, to be in the process of acting. It does come to mean success, and it's related to the Greek noun pragma, which is a deed. So I see how she's getting it, but she always seems to reduce some of the meanings in order to get the Greek word to mean what she wants it to mean for her purposes. So that's my comment. I don't know if there's much to say, but if you have clarification.
So I don't want to get into a Greek class, and I don't, partly because I'm not qualified. I mean, I've learned enough to make my way. But let's look at the next paragraph on 189. Here's what's the point, right? Thus, the role of the beginner and leader, who was a primus inter pares, the first under equals, a king among kings, changed into that of a ruler. The original interdependence of action and the dependence of the beginner and leader upon others for help, and the dependence of his followers upon him for an occasion to act, split into two altogether different functions: the function of giving commands, which became the prerogative of the ruler, and the function of executing them, which became the duty of his subject. I mean, this is what she wants us to know, right? Yeah. Is that the Greeks understood, and again, the Greeks are just here, one example, but there was an idea of beginning and rulership or leadership, in which a leader was someone who was simply the first among equals, who did something, and then other people followed in some way. It wasn't someone who was isolated and said, I'm going to rule you, and here's what I say, and you have to obey. It was much more of a fluid connection between someone who started something and someone who ruled. And this idea is one that will come up in all of Arendt's work. So, for example, on Revolution, she's going to talk about workers' councils and talk, and that so here's her argument against Occupy Wall Street and the leadership question and the individual. What she says is, you don't start from an individual on top who imposes rule from on top down, but you have all these councils and they talk, and someone emerges as a leader. And then that person goes and meets with other people who emerge from leaders from other workers' councils and county councils or local councils, and they talk, and someone emerges as a leader. And the leader is not someone who's imposed from the top down. It's someone who emerges as someone who people listen to and follow. And so this is her, her idea of leadership. And, what she's criticizing, at least on one level, is a view of rulership and leadership, which is top down. And she thinks we've forgotten this much more fluid, confused, interpolated idea of beginning, acting, and leadership.
Okay.
On the question of the Greek chorus, I mean, what is she actually saying here? It's an interesting, it's a little, it's complicated. And what she wants to say is that the actors and the characters are imitative. So the imitative element lies not only in the art of the actor, but in the making or writing of the play. So the playwright imitates people, and the actors imitate people. And thus only the actors and speakers who reenact the story's plot can convey the full meaning not so much of the story itself, but of the heroes. And this goes back to John's question, right? The meaning is not of like the whole story, but of the heroes. In terms of Greek tragedy, she says, this would mean that the story's direct as well as its universal meaning is revealed by the chorus. So the chorus doesn't reveal the meaning of the heroes, but it's supposed to reveal the meaning of the story. It doesn't imitate, it's poetry. It's the storyteller. I mean, now, whether it's right to see the chorus as the voice of the storyteller or the tragedian, you know, I don't know. I mean, that's certainly what I was taught, and it's my reading, but you know, I'm not a classicist, Nancy, so I'll defer to you if that's not an accurate.
Yeah, I don't think that's inaccurate.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think that's how she's reading it. I don't think there's a whole lot in it. It doesn't have a whole lot. It's simply to say that there's a difference between the imitative actors and the narrator, if you want to put it in that
Well, one of the qualities of tragedies is that there's no explicit narrator.
That's right.
There's really no authoritative voice unless you want to say in certain plays a divinity, like in the Humanities in the Oresteia, that Athena sort of has a resolution at the end. But certainly, like a chorus in the Agamemnon is more or less acting as a citizen body, and they don't know what they're doing. There's a kind of, they're confused, and there's no way you would grant them authoritative.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably different choruses. I mean, you know, certainly the chorus in Antigone seems to offer an interpret, you know, a philosophical understanding of the ode to man and other things that seems to provide a kind of meaning or impose a kind of meaning on the story. But this will take us far into the world of interpretation of particular plays.
Yeah.
All right, last question will go to Klaus.
Hi, Roger. This has been very stimulating. I also thought last week's discussion was extremely interesting. But, I wanted to understand, coming back to sort of the discussion of the primacy of speech in sort of with action and speech, and I was wondering the influence of Kierkegaard on her work. He talks about choice as the central figure in making yourself transparent, which is what he said when someone discloses who they are, and instead of sort of veering away from who they are, who they ought to be. And there it seems, and I mean, I know in the English language, you'd have expressions like not only talking the talk, but walking the walk, where walking the walk has more, strength and emphasis than just talking the talk. Mm-hmm. Another expression is put your money where your mouth is, or something like that. So acting in according with your beliefs. And it seems to me that, so the short question is, how does she, did she take anything from Kierkegaard on this point, to whom she seems to be in opposition, and does she maybe overvalue how the who is? It is as if the who is some sort of inner thing that has to be expressed in sort of a conscious or logical way through speech, rather than through action, which can be maybe more diverse or manifold. And I just wonder where how those things play, and if my question makes sense there.
Thanks, Klaus. The only place that I know of her really engaging with Kierkegaard is in the essay, is it The Modern Challenge Tradition or The Concept of History? I always get those two titles confused, but in those, on 178, she says, I mean, I just find this paragraph very, I already told you, a little bit unconvincing. I just don't know what to say about it. But action and speech are so closely related because the primordial and specifically human act must at the same time contain the answer to the question asked of every newcomer, who are you? The disclosure of who somebody is implicit in both his words and deeds. So both words and deeds. Yet, and this is, I mean, I haven't looked at the German on this, but yet obviously, I mean, this is, obviously, are you serious? Obviously, the affinity between speech and revelation is much closer than that between action and revelation. Footnote 4. This is the reason why Plato says that lexis, speech, adheres more closely to truth than praxis. Now, Plato is offering there, a rhetorical point. I mean, I think what you've given the idea that walk the walk, don't talk the talk. I think it's the opposite. I happen to agree with you. I don't, is there a theological element to this, to the word of God and revelation? I mean, to me, she's just wrong on this. I rarely say this. I mean, those of you, I don't understand the priority of lexis. I mean, it's just because Plato said it. And obviously I don't get it. I don't know. And so I don't know what to say, except I don't understand it.
It made me, because I was perplexed at the same part, and it made me sort of think about last time I wanted to sort of bring the same point, which is, has she really read Kierkegaard, or is it just something she said at university because it sounded cool? But because I think last time when we also spoke about work and works of art, she also seemed to have this very sort of transactional or understanding of, I have this thought and I'll now sort of supplant that into the world. And one of the things Kierkegaard says when it comes to, and he speaks about truth and also theological truth and so on, but also individual truth, he talks about indirect speech. Many of you might know, he used a lot of pseudonyms to write his philosophical works, because he wanted to, he felt that very strongly that when you spoke indirectly, that is, you more pointed at the truth than telling the truth, you got people closer. And so he seems to sort of suggest that actually speech has more, I'm not going to say deceptive, because that's not what he wanted to do, but more of a poetic quality that didn't transfer something, whereas actions and choices were more readily available to make yourself transparent, which was his word for showing who you are through your actions. So he would actually decidedly say that even the ontological quality of speech was more sort of deceptive than action would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know enough about that to say, but I think what you're saying sounds right. I don't think she got
Roger.
it from Kierkegaard. I think it's more just, I think this may have a theological, I think largely it may just come from Plato. I don't know. Jason?
Roger, if I can, let me throw something at that. When you study the science of storytelling, and I know that's kind of a funny thing to say, science of storytelling, the narratologists will go on at length at a phenomenon called the audience share, which is the portion that is left unsaid, that is there for interpretation, but the storyteller or the actor sets up the audience to fill in the gaps with their own knowledge. And in so doing, they own it. they see themselves in the role of the hero. That is the core praxis, the core science behind storytelling.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that sounds right. And I think that makes sense. But does that add to this conversation?
Well, in the notion of, coming to an understanding of the efficacy of the spoken action over the how did she put it, the
language reveals more so than action does.
Yeah, insofar as that, you're actually then leveraging the predispositions that are in the minds of your audience, and that brings.
But Jason, you can do that with actions too, right? I mean, if you stand and sit there reading Arendt in Grand Central Station, you're also leveraging predispositions of your audience. I mean, I just don't understand why, if you stand there and read it and say something out loud, it's more revelatory than if you stand there and move in certain ways. I mean, to bring us back to the point what Bill was making earlier, I think the body in motion can be incredibly revelatory. I think actions can be very revelatory. And I think in some ways speech and acts go together, but the effort to sort of say that one is more, it just doesn't make much sense to me. And I'm not going to I don't think it's a very big point. I don't want us to get caught up in it. I just don't, it's not something that it's one of, look, I love.
Could it be important? I mean, you think of the idea, you always hear the like, don't just talk, act. Those are often counterposed. I'm not saying those should be counterposed, because obviously speech can create effect, but there also is, I mean, people now talk all the time about, oh, is speech violence? Can speech have all these effects? So like, this seems like a really important question.
Well, but I mean, I would say that's the opposite, right? Part of the problem is, this is a famous line of Heidegger's, people talk and talk and talk all the time and say nothing. And, you can act and act nothing too, but I just don't see talking, which can be so, to use a bad word, cheap, as having a privilege over action in revelation.
Well, actually, this is a favorite topic of mine too. I think talking can be cheap, but it's very powerful in that there are so many words. You can associate the current action of your speaking and whatever else you're doing with just about anything in the world that's got a name. It's so tremendously powerful. So yeah, it's cheap, but that cheapness makes it very ubiquitous, right? You can connect to anything. But the body, I'm not sure, especially those of us who haven't, not limber enough to really do that much with their bodies, and then it's like you can't really connect to too many things. So in that way, speech is privileged.
Okay, I accept that. Listen, thank you all. This was great. So for next week, we're reading, I think we'll send it out, but I think it's the next 3 sections in the action chapter. Very much look forward to talking with you all and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. We'll see you next Friday.